Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic releases tomorrow on the 13th of June, and it's by far the biggest release this franchise has seen since Security Breach, and with it comes a ton of lore for us viewers to find. And while I'm sure I'll have plenty of fun losing my mind looking for lore on stream tomorrow, which you should totally watch by the way, today I have a different objective. I want to predict the lore of Secret of the Mimic and discover the true origins of its eponymous antagonist, not just in the FNAF lore itself, but also from the point of view of Scott Cawthon, all to answer one simple question. Was the Mimic planned from the start? The short answer, yes. The long answer, it's complicated. The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise obviously started with one game, Five Nights at Freddy's. But while that game was immensely successful and spawned tons of sequels and way too many books for its own good, before FNAF, Scott Cawthon was having a rough time. Scott had been developing games since the 1990s, usually simple RPGs or Christian games based on popular stories like The Pilgrim's Progress. But none of these ever branched out or reached the audience he was hoping for. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Scott started working on slightly different games like The Desolate Hope and Chipper & Sons Lumber Co., which would heavily inspire FNAF later on and make their way into the franchise through Easter eggs. But I want to focus on one game in particular, Chipper & Sons. In Chipper & Sons, you play as Tyke, a young beaver tasked by his father Chipper to work the lumber mill owned by the family business. The game has you explore the world around you, meet questionably moral NPCs, and learn way more about your father than you would ever want to. I'm sure all of you watching know the famous story. The backlash on Chipper & Sons was so large, with people saying that the characters looked like creepy animatronics, that Scott decided to take that as inspiration and make some real creepy animatronics. But there's more to this connection than meets the eye, because Chipper & Sons influenced a huge part of the story of Five Nights at Freddy's. Here's how. Chipper & Sons is a pretty weird game. While the gameplay itself is very simple and doesn't have anything too special about it, it's the dialogue the player has with the characters they meet that really throws people off. I won't get into everything in detail just yet, but to put it simply, Chipper in particular is really weird. Chipper and Son work at a lumber company, as the name of the game suggests, and they live alone in a small wood cabin. The mom of the family isn't there because... yeah, Chipper baked her into a pie. By accident. Apparently. The game has a lot of weird dialogue surrounding Chipper that seems to show there's something really wrong with this guy. He repeatedly mentions creating robots designed to imitate beavers and even having a son who would later turn into a robot himself. Later on in the game, the player must face off against a robot plant called the Fodder Tree designed by Chipper to imitate the beavers and duplicate itself into infinity. When we talk to Chipper about it, he says this. There comes a time when all a beaver's rage and sorrow are poured into something, and it becomes stronger than himself. Chipper is shown throughout the game as someone with a very dark backstory, someone who lost his wife to a tragic accident and who turned to his company to make robots and continue his work. One of the last things Chipper works on is a tree designed specifically to control everything in its surroundings, but this creation would end up backfiring on him. Sound familiar? Chipper is a parallel to Edwin Murray. No, please don't click off, I promise it makes sense. Edwin and Chipper share a lot of very similar personality traits and character arcs. Not only did Edwin also pour all his rage and sorrow into something, the Mimic, but that something would later become the FNAF universe's version of the Fodder Tree, the Storyteller Tree, which is powered by the Mimic, Edwin's creation. A lot of Chipper & Son's storytelling revolves around Chipper himself and his complete insanity, creating robots that fall apart and haunt the woods surrounding the lumber mill, as you can find a few seemingly possessed robots in the game that speak only in binary, possessed by some spiritual pain and suffering. Agony? Maybe? The line about a beaver's rage and sorrow being poured into something matches up with how Scott would write Agony and Remnant into Five Nights at Freddy's later on, with Henry pouring his rage into the fourth Charlie bot in the novels, and Edwin himself just beating the Mimic to a pulp. I'm not saying Chipper is canon to Five Nights at Freddy's, just that this image of a machine designed to imitate his creator powered by his rage and agony is something that exists in both of these games. Chipper & Sons was the template for a lot of the ideas we see in FNAF, and one of those ideas is the Mimic. I think Scott had the idea of a mimicking robot planned from the start of the franchise, and that this addition to the lore was premeditated for years. But I hear what you're saying. Surely Chipper & Sons isn't enough evidence. Well, I've got more. Quite a bit more. The first time we saw a mention of the word Mimic in the franchise was in FNAF World, with the Mimic Well ability, which summoned a character called Virtual Freddy to imitate the enemy's latest move. This Freddy variant, which is covered in the green, net-like mesh similar to the AR network from Security Breach Ruin, could possibly have been the inspiration for Glitch Trap and the VR experience from Help Wanted, but that's a bit of a stretch. Even though this was the first time we saw the word Mimic in FNAF, the games before and after FNAF World had certain interesting references to the abilities Mimic would have later on in the franchise. In Five Nights at Freddy's 1, we're told by Phone Guy that the animatronics tend to walk around at night and kill any employees they find on their way. But they don't just kill them. They explicitly stuff them into an animatronic suit while they're still alive, as the player finds out if they're jump scared during a night. While Fazbear Entertainment blames this strange behavior on the animatronics mistaking humans for endos, Surely there's more to it than meets the eye. Is this their twisted act of revenge for getting stuffed in those suits by William Afton? Or is it something embedded in their programming? The Mimic does the same with some of its victims in the books. It stuffs them into small enclosed spaces or costumes, as we can see in the Secret of the Mimic trailer, where a human limb can be spotted poking out of a mascot costume. Another example of this is Five Nights at Freddy's 2, where we're introduced to the toy animatronics. We all know how they work. They're high-tech versions of the original Freddy's animatronics, except this time they're equipped with facial recognition software designed to watch their surroundings and remember criminals from a specific database to prevent any suspicious individual from getting into the pizzeria. This is extremely similar to something we know the Mimic can do: watch, learn, and remember faces. It seems weirdly out of place for such advanced tech to exist back in 1987. Or does it? Skipping ahead to Sister Location, we saw the second instance of the word Mimic in the franchise, on Funtime Freddy's Hidden Blueprint. While playing Sister Location, there's a very slim chance of one of 4 blueprints appearing instead of the usual blank loading screen. These blueprints represent the schematics of the 4 main Funtime animatronics: Circus Baby, Ballora, Funtime Foxy, and Funtime Freddy. And while these blueprints make the true purpose of the Funtimes very clear, look at Freddy's indication specifically. That's right, Funtime Freddy has the ability to mimic voices. Something that we outright see the Mimic do in the books, Security Breach Ruin, and likely Secret of the Mimic. This is unrelated and a bit silly, but the phrase most strongly associated with the Mimic is always watching, and the vengeful spirit from Ultimate Custom Night is described as being here and always watching. Could it be that the Mimic is the one you shouldn't have killed? That might merit a video for another day. Point is, while these are the most glaring and direct connections to the Mimic and its story, ever since Chipper and Sons, before FNAF, Scott has had some vague idea of the Mimic in the back of his mind, be it through the bizarre story and character traits of Chipper, or the multiple mentions of mimicking software in the early years of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. But what does this mean? Is it an accident? A lucky coincidence? Or is there something darker behind all this? Something that we aren't supposed to realize? Until now. Let's say that I'm right. That in a meta sense, Scott Cawthon had the idea for the Mimic in his head since day one. While this is cool, surely it doesn't mean anything, right? Or does it? Well, it does mean something, because I think Secret of the Mimic will reveal to us what happened to the Mimic's programming after its creator, Edwin Murray, went missing. We're told in Tales from the Pizzaplex and the trailer to Secret of the Mimic that Edwin Murray, a Fazbear Entertainment contractor hired to create and work on mascot costumes, developed an experimental AI called Mimic-01. He used this AI on an endoskeleton of his own creation, designed to play with his son David, until David ran out on the road and got hit by a van. After that, Edwin Murray went missing, and Fazbear Entertainment lied about how the Mimic was developed and told its employees to retrieve it. We find out in the second part of the Mimic novella that this went catastrophically wrong, and it's likely that Sodom will have us successfully retrieve the Mimic and its programming for Fazbear's use. But why? The Mimic was made by Edwin for his own use. Why does Fazbear need it to the point that they'll sacrifice countless lives to get it? Well, it's for one very simple reason. And that reason is William Afton. Remember how I brought up that the Funtimes and other Fazbear characters had traits very similar to the Mimics? Well, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that Secret of the Mimic will reveal to us that Fazbear used the Mimic's code on some of his creations, and I think the one who needed it most was William. It's pretty clear that William's objective since the very beginning has been achieving immortality. Through the Mimic, he could teach his robots to emulate human behavior like we see the Funtimes do. After all, those specific animatronics are extremely intelligent, as we find out the hard way in Sister Location. And now, I have a very special guest to explain why Circus Baby is actually the Mimic. No, just kidding, although that would be very funny. My point is that William and Fazbear Entertainment seem to have used the Mimic's code for their personal and professional use respectively. This is why, by the time of the Pizzaplex, it's become a normal part of their business routine, being used for huge projects like the Storyteller Tree and its procedurally generated stories. It's likely the toys and Funtimes specifically use the Mimic code, as they're both strongly associated with AI, and are weirdly intelligent for what they are: robots. So, if this is true, and the Mimic was seemingly retconned into the old story, what does this mean for the original games? And is this really Scott's intention? Well, while I think that it's a bit of a violent change to the established lore, I think it explains some of the behaviors of the animatronics seen across the games, particularly the toys. Because there's a hidden detail in FNAF 2 that connects directly the Secret of the Mimic. At the beginning of FNAF 2, we're told by Phone Guy that Fazbear Entertainment spent a small fortune building the 1987 animatronics. But those animatronics had a pretty major flaw, and this is where we get the bombshell that ties it all together.
You're only the second guard to work at that location. The first guy finished his week but complained about conditions. We switched him over to the day shift. So, hey, lucky you, right? Mainly, he expressed concern that certain characters seemed to move around at night and even attempted to get into his office. Now, from what we know, that should be impossible. So while our engineers don't really have an explanation for this, the working theory is that the robots were never given a proper night mode. So when it gets quiet, they think they're in the wrong room. So then they go try to find where the people are, and in this case, that's your office. So our temporary solution is this. There's a music box over by the prize counter, and it's rigged to be wound up remotely. So just every once in a while, switch over to the prize counter video feed and wind it up for a few seconds. It doesn't seem to affect all of the animatronics, but it does affect one of them.
Now, you might be wondering why this is a big deal. Well, allow me to remind you what melody plays when winding up the FNAF 2 music box. My grandfather's clock. And this same music reappears in a very specific place. The first ever teaser for Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic. The reason this music box only works on the puppet is because it's the only animatronic in the building not run by the Mimic AI. That music box motif from the teaser is directly connected to the Mimic, and it's likely that the Mimic 01 code has become immune to the music box. But while the wind-up music was originally intended for all the mascots in the pizzeria, it only worked on the puppet because of its individual programming. I think this is direct proof that the Mimic's code was used by Fazbear before Security Breach to power its animatronics, and by William to code his Funtime animatronics too. An interesting piece of evidence for that second claim is the Immortal and the Restless cartoon we can watch between Central Locations nights, where Vlad, the vampire protagonist, repeatedly claims that the baby isn't mine. Vlad clearly represents William Afton with his purple color scheme and association to the undead, and him saying the baby isn't his could be a way to tell us that Circus' baby, and thus the Funtimes, aren't fully his creation, that there was something else in them, like the Mimic 01 code, but who knows. So, while this connection is pretty solid, is this what Scott Cawthon and Steelwell are trying to tell us? I don't know, we'll find out tomorrow. Bye guys! Got you, okay, let me actually answer the question. Secret of the Mimic's marketing is all about the past, which makes sense because it takes place in 1979, making it the earliest game in the FNAF timeline. I think that SOTM will lean into the idea that the Mimic was used for other Fazbear projects, but probably won't directly confirm it or anything. I think Scott's intention with the Mimic is to explain that it's been there since the start, watching everything unfold since the beginning of the tragedies at Freddy's. Is this change controversial? Definitely. Do I personally think it makes sense? While I respect the direction and the desire to tie the current era of FNAF to the original Scott Games chapter, I'm not sure this is the best direction to take. It's pretty cool, sure, but I'm not convinced just yet. I think it's intentional and that Scott Cawthon did have the Mimic planned since the days of Chipper and Sons, but I'm not 100% certain on how this will be implemented into the story in future releases like the inevitable sequel to Security Breach. But I guess we'll find out all about this and more when Secret of the Mimic releases tomorrow and I stream it live and you will be there in chat spamming emotes whether you like it or not, right? I'm personally very excited for this game and the lore it has to offer, and I'm sure I'll have a fun time toying with the idea of the Mimic being in the original games later on. Get it? Get it? Because Mimic and fun time and toy. Thanks for watching. Remember not to miss my stream tomorrow, and to like, subscribe, and comment your opinion if you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts on the Mimic being there all along in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. So, am I right? I don't know, we'll find out tomorrow. Bye guys. For real this time.